We assume that by simply accumulating human goodness, we can please God. Don't we assume that? Don't we teach our children that in Sabbath school class? Right? That if we do good, what? God what? Loves us. Ellen White even made that mistake. She told her young son, when she was away, writes a letter to him. And she said to him, God doesn't like you when you do that. Which in turn what? Means God will like you if you what? Do that. Later as a grandmother, she said, don't ever tell your children God doesn't like them. She grew. And we all need to grow in our understanding of this. Because, folks, this is essential. This is the core of the gospel. We need to hear what the Bible is telling us through Paul. And so, Paul has to say it again. Notice verse 12. We've already read it in verse 10. What's he say again? In verse 12, there is none who does good. There is what? Not even one. He has to repeat that because we don't hear it the first time, or the second time, or maybe the third time. No, no, no. There is not, in God's eyes, there is not even one. You said, well, I'm getting up and getting out of here. I didn't come to church this morning to hear this. Hey, it's not my words. Where am I getting this from? It's from Scripture. We honor Scripture as a holy word coming from God, and then let's listen. Now, I just like to hear the things I like to hear from God. Don't bother me with the stuff I don't like to hear. And unfortunately, that's the way we separate sometimes. We need the whole word, right? The whole word. And so, he says it again. What Paul is doing here is something like presenting God's MRI of the human race. And he quotes, in these next verses, verses 10 through 18, he quotes 6 Old Testament passages to get his point across. And he goes back and he reads. He quotes. He actually is quoting from the Septuagint here, and he's quoting a little loosely here. He hasn't got it exactly, because he's pulling all these things where? Off the top of his mind. And it's Septuagint, but not exactly. But after all, who's doing this? It's Paul. A little insight into inspiration and revelation of how the Bible is put together. And so, this MRI that God looks at us, He's looking at us, at our spiritual condition. This MRI shows us some interesting things. In verse 18, quoting from the Old Testament, this MRI shows us that every human being has a sinful heart. Did you know that? Maybe you already checked your MRI on that one. Every human being, Paul says, has a sinful heart. In verse 11, he says, every human being does not have a complete understanding of the way it is when it comes to their salvation. A sinful, a corrupted understanding. To point out, to bring out his point again in verse 11. He says every human being has a sinful will. It's not God's will working in us, but usually whose will? It's our will. And our will is not perfect. And so, if our will is not perfect, how can we tell our kids, you do this and this and this and this? You will it to be done, and it will be perfect. Interesting question. If our will is sinful. Again, to bring home his point, verse 13, he says even our speech is what? Is corrupted. Our speech. Who's he talking to here? If he's using Old Testament text, who's he talking to here? The religious Jews. Religious people. not talking necessarily about the pagan, although the pagan has these problems too. But he's getting very pointed here. He's talking about religious people. You and I. Again, to bring out this point, if that's not enough, in verses 15 through 17, concluding, we just have a sinful life. He's using all these texts to prove his point, back to verse 9, that we are all what? What's verse 9 say? Last three words. We are all what? Under sin. Does anyone have a New Revised Standard Version? The New Revised Standard Version does an excellent job of translating this Greek. You know what it says? And this is the way it should be translated. We're all under sin. It means, in the original language, we are all under the power of sin. We are all under the power of sin. That's what the original language means. The original means to be dominated by or under the authority of. And Paul says we're all under that authority. Now here's where we need to make a distinction. We need to make a distinction between sins and sin. What's the difference between sins and sin? We must be careful not to confuse doing things that are not right with the fact that we are dominated by an evil dynamic. We commit sins, but the real root of the problem is what? Sin itself. Because Paul will tell us another place, we are born into what? We're born into this. We've inherited this. Sins are the symptoms. Sin is the disease. We often just treat the symptoms and not the disease, don't we, folks? We do that in the physical world, and we do it in the spiritual world. We treat the symptoms and not the disease.